taking off from where we left off last week. We're going to be starting here at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 2. I think it's the last two verses there, verses 14 through 16, and we're talking about the natural and the spiritual. And then from there, it's good that we're kind of starting there because it helps us to roll into chapter 3 because there's kind of a connection there. So, surprise, surprise. So starting here, 1 Corinthians 2:14, it says, "The natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. The spiritual person judges all things, but is himself to be judged by no one. For who has understood the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ." So it's kind of interesting here, and we're going to come back to this verse a little bit later on in chapter 3. But it's interesting that the Greek word here for natural person is psychikos, which means materialist. So it's somebody who only believes in the physical world. So the natural person doesn't mean like, oh, it's just natural, like who we naturally are necessarily. It's more about a person who only believes in the things that they can see and touch and feel, right? A lot of atheists even today are still like that. If I can't touch it with my own hands, I don't believe in it, kind of a thing. And this is commonly seen when people say, oh, this is so great, Christianity is silly because we don't need God anymore, right? We figured everything out. We know that we're, so it's humanism, right? This idea that as humans, we are the ultimate authority of everything. And they believe that only what's scientifically verifiable, but it's interesting because a lot of things that people believe in, even if they're not Christians, are not scientifically verifiable, right? I mean, the pace of time or like the existence of the universe, right? And you ask these people, oh, what evidence do you have about the beginning? And it's like, at some point, they have to admit that they rely on faith, right? We may not have the explanation, but I believe someday scientists will find it. Oh, that's faith. That's not scientifically verifiable. That you will figure that out, right? It's a faith claim. So, and the truth is, we can be critical of the natural man, but the reality is that really we all start there, right? This is the life that we inherit from Adam and Eve, right? We know that we're Christians and we have these spiritual things, but like all of us come from a place where we at one point didn't have those things. And, people who only know that think, why would I go to church? Why would I read the Bible? Why would I do anything except make more money and pile up more stuff, right? And they end up seeking things in the world that don't fulfill them, right? They look for fulfillment in partying or in sex or drugs or whatever. Or they seek the answers from pills that are supposed to make them chemically happy, right? And there's a void that really can only be filled by God. But if you tell them that, the first thing they're going to say to you is, that sounds foolish to me, right? This idea that God is the answer, when I have all these other things that could be the answer, that sounds foolish. Now, again, this doesn't mean that Christians are perfect or we're above criticism or anything like that. It just means that the natural man doesn't have that last piece that they need to discern what is spiritually useful, right? Because you need the Spirit to be able to do that. So, I think to illustrate this, I have a pretty firm belief that I think our health is based on kind of like a three-legged stool kind of a thing, right? We have our physical health, our emotional health, and our spiritual health. And I think those things all work together. But a lot of people, they'll go to like a secular psychologist and they'll look for the answers to fix their spiritual problems, but they cannot be fixed by somebody who doesn't believe that there's a spiritual problem. You know what I'm saying? And it's like those things all need to work together. And so, if you're a Christian and you go to a secular therapist and it's like, well, they're going to give me all the answers I need. It's like, well, if you're cutting the role of God out and everything, you're never going to get a holistic solution because you're cutting out not just a vital part, but like the core part of everything about us, right? So you might be spiritually broken and a secular therapist is going to pump you full of drugs and bad ideas. And I'm not saying that, we shouldn't seek therapy or help or things like that, but we have to understand the limitations of a secular therapist. There have been many instances where I'm trying to help out a Christian and they take the authority of a secular therapist so highly that whatever I'm saying, it's like, well, they went to school for this, so they know better. And I'm like, yeah, but like, what about this?
Did you go to school?
Yeah, I did go to school. I did. But it's like if your problem, right? Like, why are you trying to fix this horrible situation in your marriage when your issue is sin, but you think that you're going to fix it with like a nice, acronym or something. You know what I mean? It's like in isolation.
Believers or non-believers?
Well, either one, whoever relies on the advice of a non-believing therapist, a secular therapist.
They do that because everything that's spiritual is following them, so that's no surprise.
That's why the therapist goes where they go. And so if we follow them down that path, then we are subjecting ourselves to their folly. Yeah. Yeah, and you're missing or completely misunderstanding important parts of how this life is supposed to be lived. So I always advise people to be careful with secular therapists. It's, if I told every person, don't go to a secular therapist, there'd be a ton of backlash, and they would, but still there are times where it's like, you really need to rethink the value of the therapist that you're listening to, because, they will tell you things like, if you have an issue with sin, and they may give you advice along the lines of, oh, that's just who you are, that's your identity. And it's like, no, your sin is not your identity. If you're a Christian, your identity is in Christ. You're a child of God. That's your identity. You struggle with your sin. Your sin is not who you are. A child of God is who you are, and the sin is just the baggage you have to cope with, which is very different than saying, this is the core of who you are, embrace it, which is not the message of the gospel at all.
Yeah, it's been my experience that a Christian therapist is not always biblical.
No. Yes.
Careful.
Correct.
That you think, oh, good, they're under the umbrella of a Christian counselor.
Yep.
Sounds good.
Yep.
But boy, I'll tell you what. You guys all probably know that too.
Mm-hmm.
That it is not necessarily a safe and sound place to receive help.
Right. So I was going to say that there is a difference between a biblical counseling approach and a Christian counseling approach. They are very different.
I wasn't speaking like that, but it's true.
Yeah. In the organizational context of the world around us, that's how those things are identified, even though technically, a Christian counselor should be a Christian, but they don't always point in that direction. Right. And it's, I think it's one of those things where I think we can at least agree that they have their own individual sets of problems, right? That a secular counselor, if you're following their advice, is bad, but it's easier to spot the flaws in a secular counselor than a Christian counselor, because it's like, well, he's a Christian, it must be okay, kind of a thing. So I can see, it's like the difference, like what's worth, an atheist or a false believing Christian or a false teacher? And it's like, I think false teachers are worse than unbelievers, because at least like an unbeliever, what they are, and so you should know not to trust them. Anyway, I don't want to harp on it too long, because at some point we're just talking about semantics here, but I do think that both of those things have a problem. And actually, as we get into chapter 3, we're going to see more of that kind of laid out. So I'll wait till we get there before we hit that a little harder.
Are you going to address verse 15, the last part where it says that he is himself to be judged by no one, or that portion is always befuddled like that?
Yeah, so my take on it is that when it says the idea that we are, to be judged by no one, I don't think that's a blanket statement, as in like, nobody can ever judge you kind of a thing. I don't think that's what that's saying. What that's saying is, if you're a spiritual person, the judgment of somebody who's not spiritual doesn't matter, because they don't have the Spirit to be able to judge you by. So it's like the unbelievers have no authority in judgment over you. But we as believers have authority to judge each other and ultimately the world. So, okay, so there's one other little nugget here that I wanted to kind of point out. And that's Paul's reference to Isaiah 40:13 right there, where it says, who has measured the Spirit of the Lord, or what man shows him his counsel? So he's talking about the mind of the Lord, and the Lord as in Yahweh, right? But then he says, we have the mind of Christ, which is actually a clear way of saying that Christ and Yahweh are the same God, right? Like this, like he's explaining that these are not distinct, distinct things. Like they're one and the same. This is a claim for Christ's divinity, kind of buried in the text there. And we don't teach God, but we know God because Christ is God, is essentially the formula there. So I love it when you see little examples in the text where, they nod towards Christ's divinity, because that's one of the claims that people will make, is that, oh, Jesus never claimed to be God, he's not God. And it's like, but if you look at the text, it's all over the place. It is all over the place. So anyway, that's one of those fun little nuggets there that I wanted to throw your way before we finish chapter 2. So any questions or thoughts on chapter 2 there? All right, ready to go on to chapter 3? the milk and the meat. This is a fun little passage. So Paul's going to turn the corner, and we're going to get into the meat of the problem. No pun intended. Okay, maybe there was a pun intended there a little bit. 2/3 of a pun. We'll go with that. Yeah, that's about right. Okay, here we go. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, first 4 verses. But I, brothers, could not address you as spiritual people, but as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. And even now you're not yet ready, for you are still of the flesh. For while there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving only in a human way? For when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not being merely human? Okay, so this is a very interesting passage, and it's like, that's why I'm glad we got to read that last part of chapter 2, because it's like we're talking about this idea of the natural man and what that means and stuff, right? So here's the issue. And I want to make this clear because I think I made this clear in the first one, because this is something that is really easy to forget when you read the book of 1 Corinthians, is that Paul is still addressing Christians here, okay? It's really easy to harp on the church in Corinth and be like, oh, they're so horrible, they're unbelievers. And it's like, no, Paul is still addressing them as believers, okay? He calls them brothers, right? So that means they have the Holy Spirit active in their lives, okay? But what does that mean? The problem is they have the Holy Spirit active in their life, but they're not behaving like it, okay? And so there's this debate that goes on as to like whether or not it's possible to be a carnal Christian. It's like, no, you're either a carnal non-Christian or a not carnal Christian. Like there isn't that. And I think that the issue is that we like to think in absolutes, and I think that what's going on in 1 Corinthians is an occasion where this is not an absolute situation, okay? They're Christians and they're changed, but they're not changed very much. They're not changed enough, okay? Because, this is one of my favorite sayings, the Christian walk is about progress, not perfection, okay? And I think that is a huge problem, and it has been a huge problem that we think, we forget to give people credit for progress. It's like, well, if I see that there is one thing you're doing wrong, in my head, you're less than, you're not saved, or whatever the case might be, right? So the real question is somebody making progress? But at the same time, Paul's also asking, are they making enough progress? Because sometimes it's like, well, I'm getting better. I'm not as bad as I was 10 years ago because I have 1 microsecond less sin this year, so I am improving. And it's like, Paul seems to get this idea that there's a standard of growth, right? That you should be progressing at a healthy rate, right? I apologize in advance. I'm going to share a paper mill illustration here. But you could, at the paper mill, you could always spot the new guy, okay? He walks in and he's got the perfectly clear safety glasses, the hard hat that's fresh out of the wrapper, new sleeves dangling a shiny knife, clean clothes, right? And nobody thinks any less of them because they're new employees, right? You just came out of training, this is fine. But if they looked like that 3 months into the job, they wouldn't be there anymore, right? Because there's a standard of like getting dirty and working, right? Like there's an expectation there. And I think some Christians are content walking into church after 20 years with shiny new gear that they never use. They're content never growing and never investing and never actually really making progress. So it's like this idea that like it's okay for a baby to drink milk, right? But if we're all sitting around this room now with bottles in our hands or sippy cups and drinking our milk and eating our Gerbers, right? We'd be like, okay, something's wrong with this person, right? Right? There's an issue here. And that's what Paul is criticizing them for.
If you're like trying to get healthy and put on weight or whatever, and you're not growing in a certain way, like, and your marriage isn't growing, or you've watered your plants, and and they're not growing, like there's actual deep concern. And I think it's the same with our faith. Like, if this is what we're claiming and there's nothing to show, there should be like a deep concern, as there would be in any other area.
Yeah. And I think part of that too is like, there are probably some cases in the church where it's like, somebody who's mentally incapacitated or something, right? Like it's okay for them to be on a lower level of maturity or something like that. But there should still be growth. Right. So everybody's pace may be different. So the question is, are you pursuing the Lord at a healthy pace? Are you progressing at a healthy pace? I think is the question. You know, we're not meant to settle for a cheap and effective faith.
And the other people recognize and help you recognize your fruit. Maybe
Yeah.
you're stuck because you're thinking what you're doing is nothing, and it might be something.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mary, can I share a story about you real quick? It'll make you look good and me look bad. So some of you guys know that I have a drum channel, and I play the drums on YouTube. And so on that channel, I was doing a bunch of like Real Big Fish covers, which is a band that I grew up listening to as a kid, and I recorded the songs, put them out, and whatever. And after they'd been up for a little while, Mary came to me and said that she had watched it, and that some of those songs she felt like was inappropriate for a pastor to have on his channel. And to be totally honest, from where I was at, never even considered that it might be inappropriate. Never even crossed my mind. To me, it was just like, this is the music I grew up listening to. I cut out the cuss words. I'm fine, right? And that was my perspective. And when Mary brought it up, I had to take a hard look at myself and say, you know, which it's never fun to have somebody come and tell you you're doing something wrong, right? And nobody's like, please come and tell me what I'm doing wrong. It feels so good, right? But I had to take a hard look at myself, and at the end of it, I thought, you know what? Mary's right. This is not appropriate for a pastor to have on his channel. Now, that particular song doesn't affect me because I don't base my worldview on the lyrics of that song. However, there may be somebody who watches that channel and says, this guy's a pastor. It must be okay for me. And they might be somebody who would take that song as a way to change their worldview. And it's like, I have a responsibility to consider that. And so I appreciated that Mary had the guts to come and say something to me, because most people probably wouldn't. They may have the guts to say something to somebody else behind that person's back, right? But not ever to their face. And so I
A lot of courage.
yeah, that's got to be a hard thing to do. And you could tell Mary was not like, she wasn't like, I got something to tell you, Pastor Dan, right? She wasn't like, you know, loving it, but she felt convicted that she had to hold her brother accountable, which is something that we should all aspire to do, honestly. May not be fun, but it's a good thing. And there's kind of two parts to that, because I think there's maturity in being able to approach somebody. And then there's also the maturity where we have to ask ourselves a question. If somebody tells me a truth about myself that needs change, am I willing to do it? And so I think part of that is the process of having that meat of Christianity, right?
And growth.
And being willing to grow. And so I took those videos off my channel because she was 100% right. So I took it down. So I think it's important that we have people in our lives. That's one of the reasons why Christian community is so important, right? That statement, I'm a Christian, but you don't need to go to church to be a Christian, right? Well, where are you getting your community and your support from? Where are you living out your acts of worship? Where, you know, there's a lot of questions that you have to answer in order to be a healthy Christian without Christian community. And so I think that's something that we have to consider as well. And at least for the Corinthians, they got that going for them, right? At least they have their Christian community. They're not perfect by any means. And I think that that's why it's really important that we don't forget that the Corinthians are still Christians. They're just not where they need to be. They need that pushing from Paul. The way that Alan Redpath actually puts it, he said it this way. The carnal Christian is a child of God, born again and on his way to heaven, but he's traveling third class. That's the way he described it. So, and it's interesting here because the passage we were using here, we are still of the flesh, okay? So there's actually a difference between being fleshy and fleshly, okay, is what we would say in English, okay? So in 2 Corinthians 3:3, it talks, it says, clearly you are an epistle of Christ, ministered to us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, and not tablets of stone, on tablets of flesh, that is of the heart. Okay, that's actually the New King James Version, if you guys are following along with your ESV. So that idea of tablets of the flesh, it's the word sarkinos, okay? And sarkinos actually means to be, wait, let me make sure I'm giving you the one in the right order, because I think that might not be right. Okay, so that word there for flesh is sarkinos, S-A-R-K-I-N-O-S, which means fleshy, or to be made out of flesh, okay? So all of us are made out of flesh. Even as Christians, we still have these bags of flesh that we carry around, okay? Sarkinos. But it's a different word that Paul is using back here when he talks about them being of the flesh. That's fleshly. Not fleshy, but fleshly, which is actually the word sarkikos. So just like sarkinos with a K instead of the N. Sarkikos. And what that means is not just made out of flesh, but characterized by flesh. Okay? And so that's the issue that they're dealing with here, is that a carnal Christian is not just made out of flesh, but they are characterized by their flesh. Okay? Now, Christians are going to fall short because we have flesh. There's no way around it. But as Christians, even from day one, we should be characterized not by the flesh, but by the Spirit. So do you see the difference? Does that make sense, or is it just confusing?
Characterized by who?
So in characterized by, that's a good question. That's a good question. God is the primary concern, obviously. But I do think other people, both Christians and non-Christians, I think it's everybody. I think it matters to everybody. Not that everybody's going to like you, but they should categorize you as a follower of God. I think.
But I also want to say that having a pastor that you can approach, like able to approach you, that's huge. With a humble spirit that says, "I'll listen to you," that is huge. And having a body like that it's pretty cool. Not every place there is that. But I think the fruit of the Spirit is all the dimensions of the walk is the hardest lifelong thing. And it's, I was thinking too, sometimes I feel like there's a plateau, and sometimes the two step forward, one step back thing.
Sure.
In my life, it's not been, there have been times when I think, man, I was a lot more spiritual when I was 25 than I was this last year of my life, It's like...
Yeah, but don't you think, if our walk is a race, right, and it's an endurance run, just because you come hot off the blocks doesn't mean that you're not trying 10 times harder when you're running half pace when you're halfway through the lap, When you have when the emotional excitement isn't necessarily there, or you're going through a trial or whatever, sometimes it might take, twice as much growth to go half as far, right? And I think sometimes our milestones even, maybe there are milestones, but they're not the same for everyone, and they're all different, and there's probably so many of them that, like you said, spiritual gifts, somebody with the gift of evangelism may have a completely different set of milestones than somebody with, the gift of administration. Because it's the person with administration might be like, wow, I actually talked to somebody today about Jesus for the first time in a year. That was a big step. And the evangelist is going, I talk to 10 people a day, and it's not even a problem for me. And that was my first time ever being a Christian, And it's so it's hard that because we are different. But just because we're different doesn't mean there's an excuse not to pursue growth and to figure out what our own milestones are.
I don't know that I agree with that.
Really? What part?
Because first keeps calling. Because we're not talking about growth in an occupation. So your opportunities might be different, but we're talking about the character.
I don't think it's just a character issue. Because Paul's talking about specific behavior, right? What are the Corinthians guilty of? Making claims about who they identify with. That's a behavior, not just it comes from character, of course. But I think all of us have milestones that can be both character traits and performance traits, right? I think biblical knowledge can be a milestone, right? A mature Christian should have more knowledge of Scripture, which is a tangible thing, not just a character issue. But at the same time, they should also live out a life of character.
But I feel like that is reflected, behavior is reflected from the character. So the character of hungering and thirsting for knowledge.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that one of those things is real and the other one is not. Or that one of those things matters and one doesn't. Or that one of them is a milestone and one isn't. Yeah. So what I've really liked over the last 2 weeks is that you guys are feeling more comfortable speaking up and cutting me off and interrupting me, which I actually like. I realized that just sounded bad. I didn't mean to do that. I really do appreciate that, because I mean, as much as I like sitting at the front, as much as I love talking and teaching, I also like hearing feedback and having input. And it gives me lots of things to think during the week, and it even helps me develop even as I'm writing these studies, because I start thinking, what are some of the questions I think somebody might bring up in this area, or do I need to dig a little deeper on this to make sure I have answers if it comes up, or what might somebody be wondering about this passage? And so it's encouraging to me in several ways. So I like it when you guys speak up and talk. So I don't want you to feel like you have to sit there quietly or anything like that. And honestly, the more we talk, the less work I have to do, because I think we might finish chapter 4 by the time the summer's over.
There's more in that too, isn't there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I don't even think I'm halfway done with my notes for that section. So, there's enough left to where I'm not even going to try to finish it, because I'm just going to have to make a mental note as to where we are and then go from there. But yeah, but thank you guys for talking, and if nothing else, it entertains me. So.